Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Flick, it's good to meet here during these coronavirus times. And I'm going to introduce you to the next panel, and I hope you've got plenty of patience. Well, we do not know about the times. Surely we negotiated a time budget. We would like to discuss the conflicting demands of national sovereignty and transnational solutions. Because, you know, there are a lot of transnational challenges. And for me, it is surprising that this topic of or nationalization is, being discussed again. People in EU or in other countries, people say we need economic sovereignty. And the European Commission talks about autonomous strategy, because autonomous sometimes sounds like self-sufficiency, at least when listening to the two words in German. Now people talk about transnational situations, particularly in these times. But I should say that the black swans, that is all the other systemic crises, are behind the situations and events which we see now are transnational. This refers to 9/11, international terrorism, didn't know any borders, Lehman Brothers 2008 financial crisis. And I'm sure that this will happen in the future too. And therefore, the question arises how national sovereignty and transnational competence of finding a solution can be brought together, and this is the issue which we are discussing now. We've got a wonderful panel. I can say this is really a top panelist, Dr. Wolfgang Fink, CEO of Goldman Sachs Bank Europe, without the UK, just continental Europe. Okay. Then Professor Sven, since 2016, he's a professor for international law, European law and public law at the Philipps University of Marburg in Germany, but he's also a CDU member of the European Parliament. Then Professor Wolfgang Schön. He's a director at the Max Planck Institute for Tax Law and Public Finances in Munich, and the vice president for the German Research Association, for us an important financing source. So I will be very friendly to Mr. Schön. And of course, he's also, Mrs. Flick, I think I can say that, he's also one of the founding fathers, and of course, founding mother, you might say. But there's always a father if there's a mother, isn't there? So this is the reason why he is in this position. And then we've got Professor Eugenia, the Conceicao-Heldt. We heard, or you've been introduced already, and now we're looking forward to discuss this interesting, thrilling issue that is transnational challenges, how we can, combine solutions, combining them with the fact that politics is still done on a national level. That is, the national states are doing this, but now during this crisis, we see a revival of national states that become more powerful compared to the last few decades. And this might be a kind of starting point for the resistance against, national solutions, but we talked about it already. National states do not disappear, but their significance will increase. I would like to start with our politician, Mr. Simon. The concept of open strategic autonomy, this is what Mrs. von der Leyen, a member of your party, emphasizes very much. For me, as an economist, it sounds like finding self-sufficiency. We do not want to be dependent. And if you listen to other members of the Commission, for the Commissioner for Services, Mr. Breton, he says things like, we want to levy taxes on the CO2 emissions from foreigners. And this means we will be able to serve the debts which we are just taking on these days. And this is something which we heard about in the past, i.e. generate tax income in order to pay for debts. Now, is this the new policy or policy of the European Commission, or what do you think they are doing? I think the Parliament finds this new strategy quite okay, don't they? Well, maybe there is a differentiated response in the European Parliament. You know, the answers sometimes are really different. Some of the people are not so happy that we use protectionist, say, proposal suggestions which we receive here. You know, I thought that this is a kind of spontaneous response to this crisis. At present, we all wear these masks, and in March we noticed there aren't any masks available anymore. We talked about this idea. We were recommended to wear masks because the scientists didn't know whether or not they have an effect, i.e. whether or not 2 or 3 days before an infection they might be protective. And then, you know, like a knee-jerk response, politicians said we have to become self-sufficient. I am not delighted about this idea. Germany, Austria, the EU as a whole really depends on exports. We have been very successful in the past, and I believe it is an illusion whether or not this will work out because we don't know what we need. You know, in the case of the next pandemic, you know, the gloves, and then suddenly we've got the artificial, say, rubber, which we cannot, you know, grow here in Europe. Whatever. I believe there's a crucial aspect which has been not directly mentioned today. There's an economical aspect, a side aspect, you know, trading, interdependencies, connectedness of the world. I would like to mention this because I believe it has been neglected, almost forgotten. You see, we are always, you know, negotiating or trading with each other. These parties will not wage war. So shall we have the pandemic, you know, move around and then talk about it in a very, say, relaxed, poised way and not do things too quickly, finding solutions, you know, just like this, you know, levying some fees here or there. And then, of course, we always have to work out whether this is in line with any rules or regulations or directives. I think we should leave it go and then start discussing what we want to do, also against the backdrop of the Green Deal, etc., etc. But now suddenly the Europeans come up with the idea to, you know, batten down the hatches. Now, this is something which really doesn't convince me. It doesn't convince me either. I don't know whether this is a coronavirus-based phenomenon or whether it started earlier. You know, party member of CDU and our economics minister in March last year talked about a national industrial policy. Nobody was talking about the coronavirus at the time, and he mentioned of recovering or getting back sovereignty, technological sovereignty. So we cannot trust any suppliers in China or the United States that they will really give us what we need, or if there's anything else that we need. You know, economic sovereignty, you know, the United States force us to do things which we do not want. You know, the Iran politics or Iraq politics, you know. Is this something which has been around for quite some time and is something which, you know, even is pursued in Germany? Well, you know, in history it's always, you know, history is always moving in waves. Looking at the industrial strategy, I believe it was about something different. 60 pages. Mr. Altmaier really was criticized for these pages, for this text, and some people said that it shows, you know, aspects which are too socialist. Others say it's not a strategy in the first place. Things like this. I think it is all about antitrust law, Alstrom, this decision, Alstrom, and other laws. And the Chinese companies, always owned by the government and the state. This, of course, will have an effect on their investments, which they want to bring to Europe. And we are a bit helpless because we use antitrust laws in Europe, and this means we are no longer allowing such big global players, and this of course might lead to competitive distortions, particularly when comparing ourselves with Chinese companies. These are some of the ideas, but this is not yet a strategy, I should say, and it has, and these ideas have not been pursued. This situation has been around for quite some time. We've got major global players, and we are of the opinion we can no longer control it, and that we are now on the back foot, you might say, lagging behind it. There is competitive distortions. The WTO, China still considers China as a developing country, so any subsidies and all the things, they are not really interested in that. The companies are backed by the government, and here we have companies which are kept small simply because of the laws and regulations they have to follow. Indeed, this is a problem, and we haven't found a solution yet. So this is policy which we find in Germany, responding to these inequalities, also in the context of Chinese trading. And we have foreign economics issues. We changed things very quickly and did so that nobody really had a chance to look at the details. And of course, we also had a look at capital movement. We want to restrict it. And if you look at what happened in 2009, 2010, new regulations for the financial markets, people were really thinking about the fact were thinking about improving matters. But St. Gallen and St. Evanet and others, they really still found new protectionist elements, building up new barriers. So I believe things have become large, if you like. My question to Mr. Fink, now for Goldman Sachs, do you think that, you are a global player? Is this good news or bad news for you? A world which has become very complex, which is no longer clear and easy to understand. And, you can also earn money if you know what to do, if there's a demand for consultation or advice or things like this, or is this a threat for your business model? Now, I should say that this is really a very complex question. And if we look at trade, banking always followed trade or trading. If you look at the big banks and banking institutions, they emerged because of the internationalization of trade. Now, going across borders, now this is a physical process. Of course, I can use border checks. I can do it for capital as well. And of course, can do it for data. I believe our business will go beyond the capital border checks, and it means, or rather the other way around, we are, our transactions are not facilitated. Now, if you look at the situation in Europe, United States and UK, different rules are being set up, different capital requirements are to be met. Higher separate units are introduced, and this means the costs will be higher. Costs which are passed on to the users of such services. So at the end of the day, the production factor capital is being made more expensive. This is one aspect. This is something we should never forget. Everything will be much more expensive. And one of the essential elements of trade and for doing trade means that you know your local market, at least to some extent. It means, starting contacts, getting in touch with business people, businessmen in certain markets can set up some kind of trust and confidence, and then the users can rely on that. So it's also about an efficient transmission which is to be created. If I'm a RAMS, then of course I also have a certain kind of confidence and trust which I bring. It will lower transaction costs, and of course all this will be made more difficult if I build up access barriers or if businessmen are no longer allowed to travel to China. So this would be a problem, and this means you have to use local people, and of course, again, the transaction costs will be much higher. There are many examples that for us, everything is true, like for everything else, like the physical trade. You know, such obstacles will always make things more difficult. Let me talk about data here. That is all the things that are being created creatively. So if you come up with a successful product, not only a product, but also banking services, and suddenly local regulations will affect or will interfere with this product, then of course things will become difficult too. So this is the idea, and you know this about software. What I want to say is there are lots and lots of facets which have to be taken into account. Lots of things are being communicated. I think there is a well-meant interest of the legislator and of other people saying we want to have a better, or we want to paint a better picture of our institutions. We have to understand better what these, say, financial institutions are doing. The compartmentalization goes so far that there are people. Why do we still have a global bank? So the efficiency advantages, talking about risk control or risk pooling or risk architectures, diversification of risks, all these things have been gradually, resolved. And this means at the end of the day, we will have state-based solutions. So the consumer of an organization or an institution is the one who is going to defray the costs. Deregulation of financial markets. Now, is this seen as a response or an answer to the crisis 2008 and 2009, or things that countries have done, like the bailouts? There's a question which I am asked frequently: what about the stability in these times of a crisis, and what are they going to do? Do they want to let it slip through their fingers? Maybe there are some opportunities. What about you? What about your company? How do you see the banking system? What would happen if a second wave hits Europe? One of our presenters talked about Boto Strauss, and I believe he talked about the future, and this also answers our financial market crisis. This has been discussed. We have implemented new rules and regulations, and at the end of the day, the systems will be safer. The Federal Reserve in the United States or other central banks, introduced an extra buffer, which is an element which is to increase equity and equity requirements in order to increase the resiliency of the resilience of banking systems. The European Central Bank will also look at this, not only in times of crisis. This is something what we'll see, the effect of this. We will see what will happen. If we look at the low loss provisions, that is any credit defaults, there are lots of things which the banks are going to face in the future. The regulators say, okay, we are on the safe side. We've got these buffers, and in principle, this is correct. But when looking at the risk culture, we have to, follow suit, if you like, Boto Strauss. In this situation, I should say the current situation is important, but it doesn't help if the politicians say, just, close one or two eyes in case of, borrowing or credits. Talking about continental Europe, I believe we should introduce the principle of doing banking business using the honorable merchant principle. This is very important because, on the other hand, surely the banks are very much exposed, and if there's a downturn or even a recession of the economic cycles, then this might lead to problems. Talking about the transnational companies, there are many who have a global footprint. Now here we've an expert for law, and we've got big discussion going on about taxation, about taxes, and how you can levy these taxes on, large companies, on the global players, which is very difficult. And some people want to see more in this respect. And talking about global taxation, well, this also involves global governance, doesn't it? Is there any hope that something might happen? We often discuss, tax systems, corporate taxes. It is sometimes difficult even here in Europe. What should happen, or will it be possible to have some kind of harmonization? Is that something people want, and what are the trends we see? What will happen over the next few years? Well, the interesting aspect is that over the last 10, 15 years, you might say, we see two different trends. On the one hand, we've got a globalization of the taxation structures, things which were considered to be inconceivable in 2010. Today, we've got a worldwide exchange of information about financial income. We've got a worldwide country-by-country reporting which forces major companies to publish their figures wherever they are located. We've got a relatively advanced model of the OECD together with the inclusive framework, meaning a group of 120 countries working together how to handle and how to levy taxes on trans-border big companies. So this is one thing. Then in parallel, we've got completely unilateral developments. The United States, they just single out this or that concept. The UK, they want to qualify themselves as some specialists, and behind all this, you've got complicated assumption who is going to win this taxation competition. Now, the idea that major players are to be taxed in this or that country, Google, Apple, their taxes should be, calculated in the respective countries. This is okay, but, and this is the interesting question, and it also explains the wider horizon of the architecture based on rule of law. To what extent or how much do people consider a common action as worthwhile doing? And this is the discussion which we had over the last 1.5 days, and also lots of the things that we heard today. Sometimes this taxation becomes an end in itself. People talk about the interest of a country. Now, the purpose and the means which people use in order to realize these purposes, this is being discussed. And of course, this also means that you have to give up part of your sovereignties. Every economist working on taxation problems, that there is an optimum for states. At the very top, everything is coordinated. The states levy the taxes they want, and then there's the other situation meaning that companies and enterprises do whatever they want to do. At present, we cannot say where we will end up. In the United States, we have several major players, United States, but, there are some big players in China. They're very silent because, they've got some very internationally active global players in China, but they don't talk about it. You said that I'm one of the founder fathers of our institute. CONVOCO is a success, and so success always has many fathers, but only one mother.
Okay, let me take this opportunity to ask what the timeline looks like. Actually, it's 6 p.m. Can we have a little more time? So you let me know when our time is up. Okay. Digital tax. That's something that's on the wish list again and again in Europe as well. And this is also something which means that we could tax foreign companies. I'm surprised that that wasn't mentioned, but we tax Google and Apple and use this to finance the repayment of some of the European debt. Is a digital tax something which we can get through without a trade war? Well, first of all, it might not have been mentioned, but it is found in the conclusions from the council meeting last Monday. It's one possibility for repaying some of the debt. Now, the digital tax could also be suitable here because it picks up on the clients. And once the major digital companies have an interest to act against European customers because they make huge profits, then these companies will be willing to pay a certain amount of tax. And this has a similar situation with regard to taxes for dogs. Maybe you could just forget about a digital tax and have a special fund for all of the other services made by the digital companies vis-a-vis the customers. But the problem is, this means that if you say we're going to tax the customers, then all of the developing countries will say, well, we're the customer. What about the customers from Siemens and Daimler-Benz and all of the building companies from Germany? So we'll be taxing them as well. And it's quite interesting to see that the last proposal that's been discussed is that we should do away with this or not go into this, not B2B business, but if we're talking about a private consumer on the other side, then yes. So then the Americans see Procter and Gamble being taxed in Europe, and that's when they pull the plug. These are the mechanisms out there. So we cannot expect coordination here. So if the Europeans want to go into this, they'll have to live with the fact that some of the Louis Vuitton bags will also be taxed. And if they want to introduce a digital tax, a type of customs payment, then we will see that the reactions will come. Whether that's good or bad, then I think you know more about that than I do. So the French have already introduced this. That might be the reason why it wasn't mentioned. And they keep saying that Germany cannot be interested in this because if they were to change the tax model, then of course we would be the big losers. Countries with big exports surpluses would be penalized. This is a question of global governance, and that's why this is on the long list of our questions here, tax issues. And here we also have the World Trade Organizations. Customs are nothing more than taxes themselves anyway. So that's another question that is discussed by many. The European Commission, this has been mentioned again and again. This is including this in the CO2 tax. That's also a good example. We have a global problem. We want to have international CO2 pricing. That would make sense. But we can't manage it because some don't want to go along with this. So we can say, okay, we're going to take the CO2 emissions and they will be included. Eugenia, we do this? Is this something that we have the does this make international cooperation more likely, or will it lead to just the opposite? In other words, could it result in a trade war? Is it going to make things more difficult? In other words, to have global governance and deal with these problems of global governance. The Americans, we see that there's not only been damage in trade policy, but there's also been a question of a decrease in trust as a result. Can you put it that way or not? Is this something that we would expect? Well, that is a difficult question. Can we call this a global problem? Is it a challenge? If you consider the different aspects of international cooperation, where we've made the most progress, this was with trade, for instance, or trade policy. That's perhaps the best example for successful integration in Europe. And also strong cooperation in the GATT Secretariat and in the WTO. When it comes to tax policy, this is not one of my fields of research, but we see that if we first look at the European level, you will see that there is a huge divergence in preferences amongst the member states. And this means that in this area, not even at a European level are we able to come up with a common solution. So I don't think that if we had an international organization dealing only with this aspect, I don't think that it would increase the probability of being successful here in acting together. Because in Switzerland, for instance, we have competition between the various cantons because this is a central source of income. And then you would probably need a big bang, or we had this option during the financial crisis, but it did not lead to this. It did not lead to the fact that the need for a common global solution was found, because the Brits and the Americans did not go along. We have sufficient examples in other fields of politics that when the largest player, the United States, if they don't go along, the International Criminal Court, for example, such an international organization has no chance to assert itself. If the most important country in the system does not go along. That's a very important topic. There are a lot of free riders in the social system. We also see people like that in countries that try to apply lenient standards and get their advantages as a result. When we talk about global environmental protection, biodiversity, climate change, how do we get the free riders to be more cooperative? Don't we need sanctions? Don't we have to talk about all of this in order so that we could have a type of a nuclear missile? No, we would never do so, but we need a nuclear missile as deterrence. We talk about the cavalry to get the Swiss in order. Do we need these explicit and implicit threats to get anywhere? Well, that's a good question. Well, the attempts in the shop windows, these are never used. But we have to be very careful, because we might enter a situation where we are challenged to make use of these threats in the shop window. But to be brief, I think absolute access here. We see that in a number of different areas where there is limited access. We have the single market and negotiations with the UK. You can see what's going on. So basically, it's a question of free ride social standards, financial standards, who's going to have access to the single European market. This is a very good instrument, and we can say we won't go below a certain standard, otherwise there'll be no access. You might have an automobile manufacturer. I don't know if I'm going to buy a car in the Midlands if I can't import a car, even if the standards there are ideal, quote unquote. So I think we do have a means here. Now, when it's very difficult to talk about access by the consumers, we can talk about digital aspects. We can define all of this. Once you tick I agree. What am I agreeing to? People don't usually know what they're agreeing to, but it's not always all that easy. This is a time-tested means, however. If we talk about climate protection, Bolsonaro it doesn't stop him when he talks about the rainforest. Well, you have to be smart in dealing with this climate protection. Basically, we're in an absurd situation right now. And sometimes I think that it's sort of like the times of Bismarck. He realized that there was a problem. People want more social rights, employee protection, and this was given a price. We have to do the same thing with climate protection. All the levies and sanctions, I don't think that's all that great. Take a look at the situation today. Today, those who contaminate the environment in Brazil today are rewarded, and the farmers in Europe are penalized. It's quite absurd. There are a number of considerations. Take a look at balance sheet legislation. and the external aspects, if these are included, or if we say climate-friendly behavior is rewarded in the balance sheet, for instance, then I think that will help us more than if we have bans or sanctions and try to get a handle on things that way. So rather a carrot as opposed to a stick. I like that. We have a couple of minutes for questions from the audience, but I would like to add something briefly, if I may. I believe more in the sticks as opposed to the carrots. This question, we have to have fair trade conditions, fair environmental conditions. This cannot be solved exclusively by voluntary actions. Take a look at annual reports in the social aspects of a company. It could mean that certain consumers and investors will be involved. This would be a next best solution, but that's not going to suffice. In Europe, and this is the plan for the Green Deal, if manufacturing in Europe is made much more expensive, then we will be subjected to competition which acts totally differently. Then we're going to have to look for measures such as the CO2 levy or other restrictions will be unavoidable. I wouldn't be too hesitant here, and I wouldn't just put things in the shop window. I think specifically about this. Otherwise, the whole European plan is a hallucination. Thank you very much, Mr. Fink, Mr. Seaman, Mr. Schön, and Eugenia. Thank you, Ms. Flick, for allowing us to have our panel discussion today.